Thank you for joining. My name is Josh Hayes. I am with Millipore Sigma, and what I'd like to do today is give a little talk around our thoughts and my thoughts on Bioprocess 4.0, Biopharma 4.0. You've probably heard this buzzword sprinkled around quite a bit. So really I'd like to start to unravel some of that and talk a little bit about some of the history, kind of where things are today and where we think it's headed as a biopharm industry. So from my personal perspective, I am still myself kind of untangling some of these catchphrases. I've worked with our software and automation R&D team for a couple of years, and it is an entirely different language. I think it would have been easier to learn French or German than to learn some of the jargon that was thrown around in the automation space. So really, I come from the manufacturing background and really would just like to share a few thoughts with where things are headed. A couple of general comments about the market itself. What are the drivers? Why is it going in this direction? And then some terms, for lack of a better word, between Industry 4.0, Bioprocess 4.0, Biopharma 4.0. What does it mean really from an application standpoint? How is it really being tied together to leverage in this industry to make things better and forward-looking for the next 10, 20 years as we move forward? And then a couple of use cases. Kind of where's the technology come from? Where is it today? I opted to pick the bioreactor and chromatography. I think those are processing steps that most people are at least somewhat familiar with. And I would argue they've evolved quite a bit over the last 20, 40, 60 years, depending on the technologies, and kind of how those are being springboarded into the next phase, followed by a quick summary. So, market drivers, not a major shock to anybody, right? It's all about making things faster, cheaper, more safely, right? That's the ultimate end goal for any products. And there's several ways that those goals can be achieved. There's ways that you can go faster and higher quality. Things like process intensification, right? So there are many ways to improve things from a speed, quality, cost perspective. Process intensification is things like buffer preparation can be streamlined, inline dilution, inline viral inactivation. There's a lot of processing technologies that can be improved. Better chromatography resins, better cell lines, better cell culture media. Those are all aspects of a manufacturing process that can be improved, tweaked, modified to give you more, better, faster. You can also leverage single-use technologies. I think that's something that our industry has been pushing or leveraging for the last 10 or 15 years, and it's been a very interesting evolution. I've been fortunate to be part of the single-use discussion for a number of years, and I see a lot of similarities in digital as it comes along behind where we were 10 years ago in the single-use space. But there's a lot of very well-known, well-understood advantages to going single-use. You can turn facilities over quicker. Everything is much more modular. You're not hard piping anything. That represents a lot of advantages. And then sort of in between that and around that, if you will, you have things like process analytics and software and automation. So the combination of all of these technologies, information technology, OT, automation, depending on what generation you are, what you call it, can all be combined to really start to make some substantial improvements in how we manufacture. Most of you familiar with the BPOG tech roadmaps that came out 18 months ago? Around some of their goals for the next 10 years. They have some very aggressive targets that they're encouraging the industry to take up. And you'll see it on the screen in the middle there. I'll talk about it a little more in some subsequent slides, but facility build times reduced by 70%, 90% reduction in poor quality cost, 90% product change turnover time reduction. Those are very aggressive targets. And you can make incremental changes, right? Again, better resins, better media, better cell lines. But to really get that massive leap forward, you're going to have to combine those two with other things like digital, things like software and automation and analytics, leveraging the data to make decisions faster. All of those things combined will start to help move forward into what we're referring to as the facility of the future. Again, you've probably heard a fair bit about improvements that are being made in the factory of the future, the facility of the future, and they really are shrinking. You're not seeing a whole lot of 20,000 liter capacity stainless facilities being built anymore. Things are being built on the 2,000 liter template, single use or hybrid. And again, it's all about shrinking it. Fewer and fewer people, quicker time to build, in market, for market, all of those discussions that have been had for a number of years are becoming more real. And again, it's a combination of process technologies, IT, and OT all together. So that's kind of what is pushing it. So where do we come from? Continuous manufacturing is a big part of the discussion for making this happen. I like to know a little bit of history. Wikipedia tells me this is the original continuous manufacturing operation, a textile mill, 1771. So almost 250 years ago, someone started doing continuous manufacturing. We're now starting to bring that into the biopharm industry. Similarly, somebody thought if you can do it with textiles, why can't you do it with flour? Why can't you put wheat in one end and get flour to become bread out the other end? These are just early examples of continuous manufacturing. It makes sense. We all know that it's used in the automotive industry and the petroleum industry and textiles, flour, paper. We should adopt some of the same ideas in our space. Easier said than done, right? We have the whole regulatory compliance piece that's a little bit harder to work within than a flour mill, for instance. But I think these are important lessons to learn from and things that we can leverage as we move forward. So that's kind of a brief snapshot of continuous manufacturing. Most of you, I'm sure, have heard of Industry 4.0. What is that exactly? It's the fourth industrial revolution that we're in the midst of. The first one being power, right? So steam power, water power that would power these plants. Then comes mass production, then come computers, automation, and then we really integrate the cyber and the physical. So you have the robots that are controlled on site or elsewhere, right? So it's just the continued evolution of industry. And we're now in Industry 4.0, and that applies across the board. That is not unique to biopharma, and that's really what I kind of want to dive into a little bit today is why are we where we are, and how do we leverage some of these to really take the biomanufacturing space forward. And the other, I'll say, buzzword that you might hear a lot is the Internet of Things or the Industrial Internet of Things, IoT. Anybody have a smart fridge at home? Anybody have a smart lock that they can unlock with their phone? A couple of hesitant hands. Internet of Things is really just connected devices, right? It's stuff talking to each other. It's your refrigerator knowing what's in it and ordering more eggs if you need them, for instance. Same with the locks. I think there's a lot of technologies out there that people use on a consumer basis that we can start to pull in to the biopharma space. So really, when you hear IoT, that's what it means. Industrial Internet of Things is just our way of taking the term and making it ours, so it sounds fancier if it's industrial, my opinion. So Industry 4.0, at its basis, has four major design principles, which you'll see recurring over the next few minutes as I move forward. Interconnection. I think that goes hand in hand with IoT, Internet of Things. Everything is interconnected, and we can begin to leverage that more and more moving forward. Information transparency. There's a lot of information out there. You don't have to look very far to see some very staggering figures about how much data is generated every day, be it Facebook or YouTube or a manufacturing process. A tremendous amount is generated. Decisions are not necessarily made in front of a skid anymore. They're decentralized. So Industry 4.0 starts to leverage that. And then the last piece, technical assistance. Offering advice, help, suggestions, call it what you will. Machine learning, artificial intelligence can help operators make better decisions. If they have more data, they can make better decisions. They can make more informed decisions. And then this just kind of ties back to that earlier discussion. You can improve your process, starting with intensified and connecting them together, ultimately leading to a continuous process. Then a single-use process has a lot of advantages that you can close off and therefore become a completely sterile process. And from a digital piece, you go from at-line to in-line to real-time predictive analytics. You'll also sometimes hear the term prescriptive analytics. So it's one thing to predict it's going to happen. It's another thing to prescribe a solution to it before it happens. And ultimately, the end goal for many, I would argue, is in the biopharma 4.0 space, is the autonomous facility. That's really the end state. Many people, many customers, many companies are somewhere in this roadmap with each of these different technologies. Maybe they're single use, but maybe they're completely analog. There's a lot of shades in here that people currently operate at, but most are moving towards that end state of having things connected, sterile, single use, and ultimately, we hope, autonomous. And really the take home I like to leave you with is Google Home running your manufacturing plant, right? It's very possible, I don't do it, my kids do, to walk into a house and say, turn on the lights, start the coffee pot. Why not do it in a manufacturing environment? Why not walk in and say, set up a bioreactor, turn on this HVAC system? There's really no difference between the two other than it's a different order of magnitude. But it's the same general idea. The smart factory, the smart facility, Industry 4.0, it's all distills down effectively to why not have a Google Home running it. So a couple of use cases. Again, I wanted to offer a couple of specifics because I think it's telling. I think we're moving faster and faster with every passing year, right? How many of you have ever used roller bottles and shaker cabinets? Most of us, hopefully at some point, were forced to go through the motions, certainly in school, right? And now we're in relatively tightly controlled, predictable, scalable, modular, single-use bioreactor formats, right? So that's evolved in the last 15 years. Shakers were used far before that, but in the not too distant past, it's evolved quite a bit. Then you talk about interconnectivity. Again, one of those principles of Industry 4.0. You're pulling data from a pH probe, from a DO probe. You're adding on an ATF. You're controlling it somehow through a software package that allows you to keep track of everything, control everything, maintain a constant pH, all the things you need in a bioreactor. Same for chromatography. Again, I'm doing a little throwback. How many of you had to grind up a plant, mix it with a solvent, put it in a beaker, and put a piece of paper in there? And over the course of overnight, you come back to school the next day and it's separated into different colors. Basic chromatography. 1900 was the first year that chromatography was invented by a Russian scientist. Not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, right? 120 years. Then it evolved into collecting fractions, right? Ultimately, it's a separation purification technique. You're loading in a mixed solution and you're using a gradient to separate it out and collect it one by one. We do it every day in this space. But it evolved. So I mentioned I was working for a startup manufacturing environment. That may be a generous term. But when I started doing manufacturing scale chromatography, it involved a peristaltic pump, a chart recorder, and I kid you not, a bucket. It wasn't red, but it was a bucket. And you would load a column, you would hook it up to a chart recorder, and it would go into the waste bucket. And when you started to see a peak come off, you moved it to the collecting bucket. Peak comes off, back to the waste bucket. Not pretty, but it did the job. And then today you have pre-packed columns, you have multiple scales of single-use chromatography systems, and we're always moving forward into things like inline polishing, flow-through polishing, things that are advancements that are back to that processing technology improvements that we can make to continue to move down towards this next generation of manufacturing. So those are just a couple of snapshots. Just a few other thoughts on sort of what's being done today. So you have these skids that have advanced a fair bit, you can argue. But we're now able to integrate things like smart sensors and smart consumables. Again, it's all data. Whether it's a digital signal for pH or whether it's taking a picture of a barcode and integrating it into a batch record. It's all data, but little by little, it's becoming more and more integrated. So it's not just a system taking measurements, but it's pulling data from somewhere, it's putting data somewhere. And it's all interconnected, it's all fully extendable, it's all fully modular. I think one of the pieces that gets lost in this is you can do some amazing things with data and computers and AI, but at the end of the day, it all has to be managed. It all has to have purpose. It all has to be validatable. Same for skids, right? In the old I say old days with air quotes because it's only 20, 25 years ago probably, you would bring a skid in and it would be hardwired. You would have an island of automation. It would do its job. You would take the data as a piece of paper, potentially off a chart recorder, to staple into a batch record, right? Some folks, maybe it's a USB stick that you're pulling data off of or downloading a recipe off of, but they're pretty isolated. Now, it's much more connected. Things are much more part of the ecosystem, for lack of a better word. They're all connected into that environment. So when you wheel a new skid into a manufacturing suite in the not too distant future, your system will recognize what that is, where it is, what it's supposed to do, and it will come online very, very quickly and be ready to go. You will no longer need days or weeks to validate it, put it through a lot of motions, because that can be replicated elsewhere, and you can leverage potentially data. And I think the way operators interact with systems is an important piece too. Most of you, if you've ever used a skid, bioreactor, chromatography, what have you, you stood in front of a system and there was a touch screen probably, or maybe not even a touch screen, maybe a screen with a keyboard, depending on when it was. And that's it. That's how you interacted with that system. Now, you have tablets, you have smartwatches, you have smartphones, you have wearables, you have augmented reality, you have virtual reality. There are a number of ways that you can interact with a number of systems that makes it much more seamless. I think one thing that's interesting to note here that I've been having a lot of discussions on lately is, this is a bit of a sidebar, but it ties in. How do you gamify your manufacturing process, for lack of a better word? Many companies have trouble attracting and retaining millennials who are accustomed to having everything at their fingertips at all times. That's a whole nother topic of conversation, but I find it fascinating because they expect to be able to interact with anything on a tablet or a phone or a smartwatch, and when they can't, it's a stretch, and it's difficult to attract and retain talent based on the way they're brought up. And then just kind of a snapshot about data. Again, tied to the previous discussion. Previously, a lot of islands that fed information through a user into a batch record, writing it on paper on a clipboard. That's how most of it, surprising amount, is still done today, and then that data goes elsewhere to be input, to be scanned, or what have you. But the vision is to have more of a centralized data repository. You hear the term data lakes a lot, things like that, data pools. So everything gets consolidated into a central place, and then that is parsed out where it's needed. It's pulled for reports. It's downloaded for recipes. It's pulled for analysis to track golden batches and start to really optimize manufacturing processes. But it's a much more efficient way of capturing and concentrating data rather than a biologic, if you will. And then really the last piece, this ties into that fourth principle of Industry 4.0, really of the technical assistance, right? I think there's a number of ways you can look at that or define it, but currently or historically, it's very isolated. You have a user who's doing everything, a lot of it after the fact, hindsight. But moving forward, we really anticipate everything being connected. You can envision an operator in a manufacturing suite wearing goggles and the ability to tap a button and call tech support for a manufacturer of that system and get real-time, on-demand help from an expert rather than picking up a phone, waiting for somebody to catch a flight and show up 3 days later to troubleshoot. Likewise, how do you connect the manufacturing suite to the more office side of things and writing reports, and how do you pull information from the systems? Everything will be much more connected moving forward, which has many, many advantages. And then really, how you collect that, I think, is important. I alluded to the validation piece, and I think a lot of historic manufacturing environments and automation specifically require sort of holistic validation. And if you change any one component of that because something new comes out or you want to expand or change your mode, whatever the reason may be, you have to revalidate the entire thing. But the trend really is to validate individual modules so that if you replace something, you don't have to revalidate the entire thing. You really leverage, again, data and the ability for computing horsepower to do that work so you're not starting over and revalidating everything every time you change a component of your factory's manufacturing. Modularity is very, very critical. And again, it's all about the data, right? And advanced analytics specifically. So much of what I've talked about can be applied to a specific batch, a specific process, fed batch, perfusion, call it whatever you want. But ultimately, you want to analyze that and do things better, right? And this is what ties back into the original argument around how do we get 90% footprint reduction? How do we get 90% bad quality cost reduction? Those are massive targets. And you do it through things like this. You can take in the data, normalize it, analyze it, and use it to predict and even prescribe. But then also, importantly, it has to be a feedback loop. It can't just be left on its own. You have to put it in place, tweak it, modify it, do it again. It's an iterative process that gets better and better over time. So just a couple of very brief conclusions. I think this hopefully summarizes it fairly well visually. So today you have a very well-known, very well-understood templated manufacturing process, right? You have discrete unit operations that we all know and love. We're moving towards process intensification. So how do we improve cell culture media, chrome resins, et cetera, and intensify these processes? How do we leverage perfusion so that we can run for 30 days? That's what's being pushed today. And then really the ultimate end goal is that true, continuous, connected, seamless manufacturing that integrates not only the process, but everything around it. All of the inputs, all of the outputs into one seamless solution that will really allow biopharm manufacturers to leverage everything that's available today and achieve these very lofty targets. And with that, I think I'll just close by saying our vision, turning Industry 4.0 into Biopharma 4.0, is of a truly interconnected ecosystem of everything involved inside of a manufacturing operation. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to come see me at the booth for Millipore Sigma.